So I was watching a recent video from Star Trek YouTuber Venom Geek Media 98 the other day, in which he focused on the hull classification symbols of the ships in Starfleet. More specifically, how the hull classification symbols and registry numbers don't make sense. If you want to pause this video and go watch his first, you won't hurt my feelings. I'll put a link to his video in this video's description. While I think he's right when it comes to the registry numbers, when it comes to the hull classification symbol typically used by Starfleet, that being NCC, I don't think you can say it doesn't make sense if it's never been explained on screen in the first place. Now, Venom Geek Media is a very good Star Trek YouTuber, and I've enjoyed many of his videos, especially the ones when he goes after Lore Reloaded and others, where he teamed up with Drakinifel, for example, and also ones where it's just him going over certain Star Trek details and his thoughts regarding them. In the years since Secret Hideout took control of the Star Trek franchise, I feel Starfleet has lost a lot of its naval and nautical roots. Scenes in which Detmer and Awashakun yell "brace, brace, brace" like a couple of civilian flight attendants when the Discovery is about to crash into something, instead of the more naval warning of "all hands, brace for impact," are demonstrative of what I'm talking about. Let's not forget that Michael Burnham even scolded a subordinate for replying with "aye, aye," telling him that one eye is sufficient and that we're not pirates. "Aye, aye" is actually the proper naval reply. It means "I understand," while just one eye is the informal version of this. Then there's all the times on Strange New Worlds where junior officers overstep their authority and give orders to do things like fire the weapons while the commanding officer is standing right there and just letting them do it without any repercussions.
No life signs aboard. All crew have safely cleared the refinery.
Fire torpedoes! Torpedoes away.
But I digress. The point of my channel's Star Trek content has, largely, been about pointing out the naval roots of Starfleet and attempting to explain where a lot of the ideas in Star Trek came from. Now, in Venom's video, he points out that nobody knows canonically what NCC stands for. I want to suggest that he is perhaps looking at the hull classification symbol as an acronym and not as a symbol. You see, in the United States Navy, which is what Starfleet was originally based on, the letters that come before the hyphen and the hull number are not to be taken as an acronym, but rather as a symbol. Now, this was not exactly true in the first half of the 20th century, but it became the way things were at about the midpoint of that century with the advent of nuclear power and new weapon systems that necessitated a change to these registries to differentiate between different types of vehicles and the weapons they carried. When it comes to submarines, the hull classification symbol in the early part of the 20th century was SS, which originally stood for submersible ship. When nuclear-powered submarines came into being in the 1950s, a new hull classification symbol was needed to differentiate these new ships, at a glance, from the diesel-powered ones, so an N was added to SS. Seems easy enough, but other ships in the fleet have more confusing hull classification symbols, like aircraft carriers. CV is the base symbol for all U.S. aircraft carriers. It originally stood for Carrier Volplane. What is a volplane, you ask? Volplaning is controlled diving or landing from a steep angle, particularly with the engines cut off, which is exactly how aircraft used to have to land on the first carriers. Since then, every carrier in the U.S. fleet has had some variation of CV as its symbol, including the modern CVN for nuclear models. These hull classification symbols often don't make sense to civilians when they look at them. For example, battleships used to have a symbol of BB. Why two Bs? Primarily this was done to avoid confusion with other hull classification symbols of ships of that era, like monitors, for example, which had the symbol of BM. Like I said, This can be confusing if you don't know naval history or naval thinking. The point is, if we apply naval traditions to Starfleet, which we should, then NCC is a hull classification symbol and not an acronym. However, since the letters that make up hull classification symbols originally did stand for things, we can surmise that NCC did at least at one time stand for something directly. Venom mentions an old non-canonical source that identified NCC as standing for, quote, Naval Construction Contract. I agree that this is probably some civilian's idea, a civilian who was trying to figure something out without consulting a naval expert. Such people, in my view, have always been the bane of Star Trek behind the scenes and ultimately cause more confusion rather than is necessary when it comes to the details of Star Trek. Naval Construction Contract is also very reminiscent of the Soviet Union's old project number system for classifying their ships, and so we can confidently reject this idea out of hand. Now, if Paramount approached me one day and said, Darren, we love your channel, you're so insightful and a veritable fountain of good ideas, we should have hired you as a consultant for Star Trek years ago and maybe even made you a co-showrunner. Please forgive us for this profound lack of wisdom and judgment. Could you please help us explain officially what NCC stands for? I would say, sure. Given that the vast majority of Starfleet vessels have the NCC symbol, I would have to conclude that NCC stands for Starship. Now, what is a starship? In Star Trek, a starship is a ship that can travel in multiples of the speed of light. That's it. That's the definition. Now, a starship can fulfill specific subcategorical roles like explorer, cruiser, patrol vessel, etc. We often see the same ship classes performing very different roles, so this works within the boundaries of what we've seen. But their defining characteristic is that they can all travel at multiples of the speed of light. So if I were to come up with a meaning for the letters NCC, this is what I would come up with. Since Starfleet is fond of Latin, with slogans like S aspera ad astra and Ex astris scientia, I would look to Latin for the N and choose navis, which is Latin for ship. As for the double C, I would look to scientific equations. C typically stands for the speed of light in equations like E equals mc squared. Having two C's would denote that the ship travels in multiples of the speed of light. But really, at this point, I hope nobody tries to come up with a canonical explanation for NCC because, and especially with who currently calls the shots over at Star Trek, they would most certainly make a fine mess of doing so. Hey, do me a favor. See that little like button down below this video? Go ahead and press it. Do it. Do it now. It is somewhat appreciated.